People think getting fired is the end. For me, it was the exact moment I had patiently waited for over the past 6 months. When my smug new boss slammed my termination paper on the desk, he had no idea he just triggered a lockdown clause on the company's biggest project. He thought he was tossing out a stubborn employee. Instead, he just handed me $290 million to start my own empire. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Unfortunately, YouTube recently turned off our monetization feature, leaving us without an operating budget to keep bringing you these tales. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to sustain their livelihoods and continue creating more content for you. You can do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment. My name is Phoebe Hayes. I am 32 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I was the Director of Fiduciary Wealth Management at Vanguard Pinnacle Properties, operating out of a sprawling corner office in downtown Miami. Vanguard is the kind of real estate development firm that builds monuments to excess. They erect towering glass structures along the coastline, penthouse suites with private elevators, and infinity pools that bleed seamlessly into the Atlantic horizon. They build the playgrounds for the ultra-rich, but to build those playgrounds, a firm needs colossal amounts of capital, and that was exactly where I came in. My actual job was not what most people in the corporate world would expect. I did not sit at a desk under fluorescent lights from 9 to 5 typing up useless, harmless reports just to appease middle management. I did not participate in meaningless team-building exercises, and I certainly did not pretend to care about the company's quarterly newsletter. Instead, I was the sole holder of an exclusive fiduciary license, acting as the designated representative for a very select, very quiet group of anonymous private billionaires. These were individuals whose wealth could shift local economies overnight, and they demanded absolute, unwavering discretion. For 7 long years, I offered silent, methodical dedication to my role. Through my exclusive personal license, I funneled massive, uninterrupted streams of working capital into Vanguard. My clients were the invisible lifeblood of the entire organization, providing the sheer financial weight necessary to fund those ultra-luxury coastal real estate projects from the ground up. These developments took anywhere from 5 to 10 years to complete, requiring hundreds of millions of dollars in upfront cash. To the senior executives at Vanguard, the money seemed to just magically appear. Quarter after quarter, they grew so arrogant and so accustomed to the golden goose that they completely forgot who actually held the leash. Then came Julian Vance. Julian was brought in as the new chief executive officer, descending upon our Miami headquarters like a plague dressed in an overpriced, poorly tailored suit. He brought with him the most cliché restructuring mindset imaginable. He was the physical embodiment of exploitative, condescending arrogance, a trait so uniquely characteristic of the truly incompetent. Julian did not understand how Vanguard actually secured its funding. He only cared about asserting dominance over the people who worked under him. He spoke in loud, empty buzzwords, constantly preaching to the board about optimizing workflows, creating corporate synergy, and trimming the fat. It did not take long for his roaming, a predatory gaze to land directly on me. Julian immediately targeted me, and the reasons were painfully obvious to anyone paying attention to the office dynamics. First, I did not flatter him. When he walked into a room expecting applause and subservience, I barely looked up from my tablet. Second, I was rarely ever physically present in the main office. My role required me to be exactly where my clients were, which meant I operated entirely on my own time and terms. Finally, and perhaps most infuriatingly to his fragile ego, my personal schedule was completely restricted. On the shared corporate system, my calendar simply showed blocks of time marked as private or off-site. To a man with an ego the size of a blimp, my independence was an unforgivable insult. He needed absolute control, and my quiet autonomy threatened the grand illusion of his supreme authority. He could not stand that a 32-year-old woman seemed to operate completely outside his jurisdiction. So, The petty retaliation began. He started by aggressively slashing my executive perks. My dedicated parking space in the VIP garage was suddenly reassigned to a junior vice president. My corporate expense account was frozen pending his own personal review. But the true escalation came when he summoned me to his glass-walled office for a mandatory one-on-one meeting, visibly eager to put me in my place. Phoebe, we need to have a serious discussion about your visibility in this organization. Julian sneered, leaning back in his leather chair and steepling his fingers together. I am looking at the corporate calendar, and your schedule is a black hole. You are not at your desk. You are not checking in with the executive team. I need to know exactly where you are and who you are meeting with, every single minute of the workday. I stared at him, my expression perfectly blank and unbothered. Julian, my client meetings are strictly confidential. The nature of my fiduciary license prohibits me from logging the names of my clients or the specifics of our discussions on a publicly accessible company server. It is a matter of strict legal compliance. His face flushed a deep crimson, the veins in his neck bulging slightly against his crisp white collar. I am the chief executive officer of this company, he snapped, leaning forward and slamming his hand flat onto the mahogany desk. There are no secrets from me. From now on, you will provide a minute-by-minute report of every partner meeting, every lunch, and every off-site excursion. You will prove to me that you are actually working and not just riding the coattails of this institution. If you want to keep your title, you play by my rules. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or try to explain that he was aggressively stomping on a loaded landmine. I simply gave a tight, polite nod. He wanted to play a game of absolute authority, completely blind to the fact that he was picking a fight with the only person holding the keys to the vault. Despite the stifling new mandates handed down from the executive floor, my daily routine did not break. I continued my essential engagements with the private billionaire syndicate. These critical gatherings were never held in the sterile, glass-walled conference rooms of the Vanguard building under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Instead, we met at highly exclusive, members-only clubs tucked away in the shadowy, ultra-affluent corners of the city. These were fortresses of old money, places where the initial membership fee alone was more than what most corporate vice presidents earned in 3 full years. My objective during these meetings was absolutely vital to the survival of our firm to negotiate and renew the specialized capital retention agreements that acted as an ironclad, impenetrable shield around their vast personal assets. To maintain the absolute secrecy they strictly demanded, I had to keep my digital footprint on the company servers entirely vague. I populated my shared corporate calendar with blocks of time labeled simply as partner lunch and market update. To any rational person, it was standard, innocuous corporate jargon. But to Julian, those harmless little blue blocks sitting on his monitor were an insult. He viewed them as a direct, insolent challenge to his authority, a blatant refusal to bow to his new micromanagement regime. The tension brewing in the office quickly mutated from a quiet Cold War into uncomfortable public theater. Julian began utilizing the weekly company-wide briefings as a stage to assert his dominance. Turning his crosshairs directly on me for maximum impact, we would sit around the massive oak table, over 30 senior executives trying not to breathe too loudly, while he paced the length of the room like a warden. We are entering a new era of absolute accountability, Julian announced loudly during a tense Tuesday morning briefing, his eyes darting across the room before locking maliciously onto my face. Vanguard will no longer support dead weight. We have certain directors in this very room who seem to believe that a partner lunch taking up 4 hours of the workday is an acceptable use of company time. Let me make this perfectly clear. Sitting in a high-end restaurant sipping sparkling water is not driving revenue. It is nothing more than feeding off the hard work of the people who are actually sitting at their desks in this building. The boardroom fell completely silent. A few colleagues cast nervous, sympathetic glances my way, but no one dared to speak up or intervene. I did not flinch. I just kept my eyes fixed firmly on my legal pad, my face an unreadable mask. silently taking detailed notes on the very trust funds he was blindly mocking. I forcefully swallowed the natural urge to defend myself or snap back. Let him talk. Let him feel large. His growing paranoia and need for absolute control eventually drove him to cross a massive legal and ethical line. I noticed the subtle signs first on my company-issued laptop. The battery was draining much faster than usual, losing 50% of its charge in just 2 hours, and the internal cooling fan ran constantly, even when no heavy applications were open. A quick diagnostic run through a secured private server over the weekend confirmed my worst suspicions. Julian had ordered the information technology department to secretly install stealth background tracking software onto my machine. He was actively pinging my global positioning system location every 15 minutes, desperately trying to build a documented, irrefutable case of time theft by proving I was nowhere near the financial district during prime working hours. He was hunting for a definitive reason to ruin me, blissfully unaware of the catastrophic trap he was willingly walking into. Instead of storming into the Human Resources Department to loudly report a gross invasion of privacy, I chose a much quieter, far more lethal path. I fought back in the only language I truly respected: airtight legal contracts. Working late into the night from my highly secure home network, I quietly drafted comprehensive, heavily encrypted addendums to every single trust agreement under my control. I adjusted the fiduciary terms with absolute surgical precision. The newly added clauses explicitly stated that the entire flow of capital was strictly tied to my individual operating license. If Vanguard Pinnacle Properties terminated my employment without a legally justifiable, fully documented cause, every single dollar of that massive funding would instantly lock down, severing all ties with the firm, and follow my license out the door. Of course, my clients had to review and sign off on the new terms. During a private evening meeting at a secluded, dimly lit cigar lounge, my largest and most influential investor, Mr. Silas, reviewed the thick stack of paperwork. He was an older gentleman, sharp as a razor, who had built a massive fortune in international shipping over the past 40 years. Phoebe, my private security team flagged the tracking software pinging from your device exactly 3 days ago. Mr. Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble as he uncapped his solid gold pen to sign the final page. This new executive of yours is acting like a desperate, cornered rat. It is a terrible, highly invasive move. I can make a single phone call to the board of directors right now and have him permanently removed by tomorrow morning. I reached across the dark mahogany table, took the newly signed documents, and slipped them carefully into my leather briefcase, securing the brass lock. I deeply appreciate the offer, Mr. Silas, I replied, my tone perfectly calm and steady, but I must ask that you let this situation play out naturally, exactly as it is going. Consider it a necessary stress test for the firm. We need to see exactly how far his blind arrogance and greed will push him. When the time is right, the fallout will take care of itself. He chuckled, a dry, knowing sound that echoed softly in the quiet room, and raised his crystal glass. You are a profoundly dangerous woman to cross. Very well. Let the arrogant fool dig his own grave. The sky over downtown Miami was a suffocating, heavy slate gray on that fateful Tuesday morning, setting a perfectly dismal stage for the theater of the absurd about to unfold. I received a highly unusual, high-priority calendar alert at 8:45 in the morning, summoning me to an emergency disciplinary hearing on the executive floor. There was no stated agenda, only a mandatory attendance requirement. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the main boardroom, the room was already filled to capacity. The entire board of directors was seated rigidly around the massive conference table, their expressions a mix of dread and morbid curiosity. At the far end sat the head of Senior Human Resources, looking incredibly uncomfortable and avoiding my gaze entirely, and standing right at the head of the table, practically vibrating with triumphant, unearned glee, was Julian. Behind him, the massive multimedia projector screen had been pulled down from the ceiling. It was brightly illuminated with a deeply detailed, highly invasive spreadsheet, completely cross-referenced with global positioning system heat maps. He had actually gone through the trouble of color-coding the exact locations of my private club meetings over the past 6 months. "Take a seat." "Phoebe," Julian ordered, his voice echoing loudly and sharply in the tense silence of the room. He pressed a button on his remote control, and the massive screen zoomed in on a dense cluster of red dots representing a highly exclusive, private golf resort on the edge of the city. "We are all gathered here today to address a deeply disturbing pattern of gross negligence and blatant corporate fraud. Over the past 24 weeks, you have logged over 120 hours of what you falsely categorize as partner lunches and market updates. Yet, our internal data tracking definitively proves that you were lounging at country clubs, fine dining establishments, and private offshore estates." He paced deliberately down the length of the long table, his eyes wide with manufactured outrage, playing directly to the silent board members. "You have systematically and shamelessly violated our core code of conduct. You have stolen precious time and vital resources from Vanguard Pinnacle Properties, while the rest of this executive team was actually in the building doing the real work." I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, resting my hands lightly on the polished mahogany surface. I did not immediately speak. I did not desperately try to defend myself or launch into a panicked explanation about the nature of high-level client relations. I simply let the dead silence stretch for 5 agonizingly long seconds to ensure every single person in the room felt the heavy, uncomfortable gravity of his accusations. "Therefore," Julian continued, his voice rising to a dramatic, self-satisfied crescendo, "effective immediately, your employment at this firm is officially terminated with cause. Your access to all corporate servers, all email accounts, and the internal financial networks was permanently revoked exactly 3 minutes ago." He gestured aggressively toward the frosted glass doors at the back of the room. 2 large, broad-shouldered security guards dressed in dark corporate uniforms were standing at strict attention, their hands resting menacingly on their utility belts. "They are here right now to escort you down to your office, watch you pack only your personal items, and walk you directly out of the front lobby like the liability you are. You are no longer welcome on this property." The room remained dead silent. The senior board members stared intently at their yellow legal pads, absolutely refusing to meet my gaze. I slowly stood up, carefully smoothing the tiny wrinkles from my tailored skirt. I looked straight past Julian's flushed, victorious face and made direct, piercing eye contact with the chief legal counsel, who was sitting nervously near the corner. "Before you finalize this extremely hasty and permanently damaging decision, Julian," I said, my voice eerily calm, thoroughly measured, and entirely devoid of any panic, "I highly recommend that you instruct the legal department to run a thorough, immediate review of the asset lockdown clauses embedded in the primary fiduciary agreements. Specifically, you need to look at Section 4, Paragraph B, regarding the unilateral termination of the primary license holder." Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh that bounced harshly off the glass walls. "Do not try to bluff your way out of this room with empty, pathetic legal threats. I have already consulted extensively with human resources. We are well within our legal rights to fire an insubordinate employee for egregious time theft. I am certainly not going to waste another single second of my day digging through obscure trust files just because you are desperate to save your own skin." He snatched a heavy black fountain pen from his tailored breast pocket, picked up the official termination order lying on the desk, and signed his name with a violent, aggressive flourish. He shoved the paper forcefully across the table toward me. "It is done. You are finished here. Goodbye. Phoebe?" I calmly picked up the single sheet of paper, folded it neatly into perfect thirds, and slid it into my blazer pocket. "As you wish," I replied softly, my tone completely indifferent. I turned away from the executive table and began walking toward the exit, my heels clicking rhythmically and steadily against the hardwood floor. Just as I reached the door, I paused and slowly glanced back over my shoulder. I allowed a very small, deeply genuine, and razor-sharp smile to curve my lips. My eyes locked directly onto Marcus, the chief financial officer of Vanguard. Unlike Julian, Marcus actually understood how the firm survived day to day. He knew exactly where the massive streams of money came from. As he saw the calm, predatory certainty radiating from my expression, the color completely drained from his face, leaving him pale and ashen. A heavy bead of cold sweat materialized on his forehead. His hands began to tremble slightly against the surface of the table. He knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that Julian had just made a catastrophic, unfixable error. I pushed the heavy door open and walked out, letting the two security guards trail behind me like a royal escort. At exactly 6:15 on Wednesday morning, the highly automated financial protocols of Vanguard Pinnacle Properties initiated their daily startup sequence. These systems were designed to seamlessly route millions of dollars to various contractors, suppliers, and municipal permit offices to keep the massive real estate engine running smoothly. But instead of the familiar, comforting green confirmation lights illuminating the dark accounting floor, the primary server screens flashed in a blinding, violent shade of red. Marcus, the chief financial officer, had arrived early to prepare for the end-of-month reconciliation. He stood over the desk of his lead accountant, his eyes locked onto a massive error code that refused to clear. Access permanently denied. The master escrow account, which currently held exactly $290 million of highly liquid operating capital, was completely sealed off. The digital vault doors had slammed shut. Marcus experienced a sudden, sickening drop in his stomach, a visceral reaction to the sheer magnitude of the frozen asset. He did not bother routing his inquiry through the standard corporate channels. He immediately grabbed his secure desk phone and dialed the private, unlisted direct line to the senior vice president of their primary international bank. The phone rang 3 agonizingly slow times before a cold, strictly professional voice answered. Marcus demanded an instant override, his voice cracking with rising panic. The banker did not hesitate before delivering the fatal blow. "Marcus, there is absolutely no system glitch," the banker stated with chilling indifference. The master account was subjected to an immediate, hard freeze at exactly 9:45 yesterday morning. The designated fiduciary license holder, who is the sole authorized signatory for that specific syndicate, was forcefully removed from your internal human resources registry, without her active biometric authentication and legally binding signature. Those funds are untouchable. They are legally dead to your firm. While Marcus felt his entire career flashing before his eyes, Julian strolled into the executive suite at 8:30, practically radiating a sickening aura of unearned victory. He was wearing a brand-new, custom-tailored navy suit, holding a steaming cup of artisanal espresso, and acting like a triumphant king surveying his conquered lands. Marcus intercepted him in the main hallway, practically physically blocking his path. Marcus was pale, sweating profusely, and visibly shaking. "Julian, we have a catastrophic situation on our hands," Marcus stammered, his voice hushed but frantic. "The main capital pipeline is dead. The bank locked down the $290 million. The entire escrow is frozen because you fired Phoebe." Julian simply let out an exasperated sigh, rolling his eyes as if he were dealing with a frightened toddler. "Marcus, please stop acting like a dramatic amateur," Julian sneered, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "This is nothing but a temporary administrative hurdle. Have the legal department draft a standard change of management mandate immediately. We will just file the paperwork and transfer the primary account manager title directly into my name by 3 o'clock this afternoon. It is basic corporate procedure. Do not bother me with trivial paperwork again." But Julian was living in a complete, narcissistic fantasy. It was not basic corporate procedure. It was a highly orchestrated financial execution. Less than 2 hours later, the illusion of his absolute control shattered permanently. The blow did not come in the form of an internal memo. It arrived via a team of stone-faced couriers carrying heavy leather briefcases. They bypassed the front desk entirely and marched straight into the executive boardroom, representing one of the most ruthless, high-powered corporate litigation firms on the eastern seaboard. They dropped a massive, heavily bound legal dossier directly onto the mahogany table. The language printed on those crisp white pages was flawlessly brutal. The legal team representing the anonymous billionaire syndicate officially declared that Vanguard Pinnacle Properties was in severe unmitigated breach of the master trust agreement. The core violation was explicitly clear: the unilateral termination of the key fiduciary manager without any legally justifiable, fully documented cause. The dossier heavily emphasized a terrifying reality that Julian had completely failed to comprehend during his blind power trip. That massive, world-changing fortune did not belong to the company. It had never belonged to Vanguard. The money was the sole, private property of the ultra-wealthy individuals standing quietly behind me. Because the sacred protective covenant had been violently broken by my unwarranted dismissal, the clients were officially executing their right to demand an immediate, total withdrawal of their capital. They wanted all $290 million pulled from the firm's grasp instantly. The real-world ripple effect was instantaneous, devastating, and impossible to hide. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the sudden lack of emergency disbursement funds slammed directly into the active construction sites scattered across the sun-drenched Miami coastline. General contractors, who strictly required daily wire transfers to pay their massive union crews and secure expensive raw materials, immediately pulled the plug on all operations. Giant, yellow industrial cranes stopped moving mid-air, hanging over the city like mechanical skeletons. Heavy machinery engines were killed abruptly. Hundreds of seasoned construction workers simply sat down on the half-poured concrete foundations, refusing to lift another hammer or pour another ounce of cement until the missing money cleared their accounts. The entire booming skyline of the city, which was supposed to be Vanguard's ultimate crowning achievement, turned into a silent, paralyzed graveyard of steel and glass in a matter of hours. The company switchboards lit up constantly as furious foremen demanded answers. Inside the executive suite, the atmosphere shifted violently from arrogant triumph to absolute, suffocating terror. Julian stood at the head of the boardroom table, staring blankly at the stack of legal threats. His hands were visibly trembling, and the confident, tanned color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. The crushing reality of his own colossal stupidity finally crashed down upon his shoulders. He was no longer the apex predator who had successfully purged a rebellious subordinate. He was a desperate, trapped rat inside a rapidly sinking ship. Complete panic took over his mind. He frantically grabbed his office phone and dialed my personal cell phone number, his fingers slipping on the keypad. It went straight to a dead, automated tone. He pulled out his personal device and tried again. Blocked. He screamed at his executive assistant to send urgent, high-priority emails to my private address, begging for a meeting. They bounced back instantly with permanent delivery failure notices. He was completely cut off. He ran around his luxurious glass cage, desperately gasping for the financial air he had just choked out of his own empire, while I remained completely unreachable, watching the beautiful chaos unfold exactly as I had planned. The true brilliance of this trap was not just that the massive funds were completely frozen, it was how deeply the venom had already seeped into the personal financial foundation of the very man who fired me. While the heavy construction sites across the city stood dead quiet under the blazing sun, the executive board of directors convened a second, much more desperate emergency session in the main conference room. The senior company auditors had frantically torn through the corporate financial archives and uncovered a horrifying, tightly kept secret regarding the compensation package of our new leader. Julian had proudly negotiated a massive, highly lucrative deal when he joined Vanguard Pinnacle Properties. However, the exact structure of his guaranteed year-end bonus and his highly prized preferred stock options were heavily leveraged directly against the projected profit margins of the specific fiduciary trust I was solely managing. He had unknowingly collateralized his entire financial future on my continued presence and success. By signing my termination paper with such gleeful arrogance, he had instantly and permanently zeroed out his own personal wealth. Furthermore, the frantic legal team finally pulled the original, dust-covered hard copies of the master trust documents from the deepest underground storage vault. As they desperately scanned the thick pages, they discovered that the strict personalization clause tying the massive capital exclusively to my license was not a recent defensive addition. It was an ironclad condition explicitly demanded and legally inserted by Mr. Silas himself exactly 5 years ago. The firm was now staring directly down the barrel of a fully loaded financial gun. The penalty fees for breaking this specific protective covenant amounted to tens of millions of dollars, a staggering sum that Vanguard simply did not possess in liquid cash. With the primary monetary pipeline completely dry and the catastrophic breach of contract loudly ticking down, the entire corporate organization was suddenly teetering on the absolute edge of immediate, unavoidable bankruptcy. While the polished walls were rapidly collapsing inside Vanguard headquarters, I decided it was the perfect, highly calculated moment to detonate the second explosive charge. The major financial news outlets across the city simultaneously received a synchronized, highly detailed press release that sent massive shockwaves through the entire investment sector. The grand revelation laid the absolute truth bare for the entire corporate world to witness. Those long, quiet afternoons at exclusive golf clubs and luxury lounges, the very hours Julian had publicly mocked as lazy coffee breaks and blatant time theft, were absolutely not social visits. They were intense, high-stakes boardroom negotiations held in the shadows. I had spent the last 6 months methodically and quietly structuring a completely independent, fully licensed wealth management firm. Every single billionaire in the private syndicate, the exact same people keeping Vanguard alive, had unanimously agreed to defect. They were providing full, 100% financial backing for my new venture. Julian truly thought he was catching me slacking off in the middle of the workday, but in reality, he was blindly watching me architect his total professional destruction right under his nose. The sheer, unadulterated humiliation of the situation inside the Vanguard executive suite was absolute. The senior board of directors rapidly realized that their shiny new chief executive officer had practically wrapped up the keys to their kingdom and handed them directly to their newest, most powerful competitor. They aggressively cornered Julian in his own glass-walled office. There was absolutely no more deferential treatment, no more polite corporate speak, and zero respect for his lofty title. The seasoned chairman of the board delivered a brutal, uncompromising, and deeply embarrassing ultimatum. Julian was strictly ordered to physically leave the building immediately, drive directly to my private residence, and do whatever it took to get me to sign the emergency release forms. The chairman loudly demanded that he get down on his knees and beg on my doorstep if necessary, because my signature was the singular thing standing between the massive company and total. Humiliating liquidation. The arrogant, untouchable predator was violently stripped of his artificial power, reduced to a pathetic, terrified errand boy sent to grovel before the very woman he had publicly and gleefully humiliated just 24 hours earlier. I was enjoying a remarkably quiet, peaceful afternoon in the sprawling, sunlit living room of my private Miami residence when the heavy brass doorbell finally rang. My personal security detail intercepted him at the gate and silently escorted Julian inside. He looked like a completely shattered, hopelessly broken man. The crisp, impossibly sharp tailored navy suit from yesterday was severely wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. His silk tie was pulled loose, his perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and his eyes were heavily bloodshot from pure, unadulterated panic and severe sleep deprivation. He stood awkwardly and fearfully in the center of my imported Persian rug, clutching a thick manila folder with violently trembling hands. "Phoebe, I am begging you. Please," Julian choked out, his voice a raspy, desperate whisper completely devoid of its former booming, theatrical arrogance. "The board of directors is going to completely destroy me. The company is going under by the end of the week. I was wrong. I will immediately double your base salary. I will give you my corner office. I will publicly apologize in front of the entire staff tomorrow morning. Just please, sign the reinstatement papers and release the frozen funds. You have to save us from this mess." I remained comfortably seated on my plush velvet sofa, taking a slow, incredibly deliberate sip of my warm herbal tea. I looked up at him with an expression of mild, detached amusement, letting him twist in the agonizing silence for a few precious seconds. "Julian, you do not seem to understand the stark reality of your current situation," I said smoothly, carefully setting my delicate porcelain cup down on the heavy glass table. "You cannot offer me a senior executive position at a company that is already dead." I calmly reached into a sleek, black leather portfolio resting quietly on the cushion next to me and slowly pulled out a single, beautifully embossed sheet of heavy parchment paper. I slid it smoothly across the polished glass surface directly toward him. It was absolutely not a Vanguard reinstatement form. It was a legally certified, irrevocably binding financial transfer certificate. Julian leaned forward heavily, his wide, panicked eyes desperately scanning the pristine printed text. He completely stopped breathing. His jaw went slack. The document officially and permanently confirmed the total, unrestricted migration of the entire $290 million. The massive fortune had been legally severed from Vanguard Pinnacle Properties forever, and successfully deposited directly into the primary holding accounts of my newly established independent firm. "You see?" I smiled warmly at him, a sharp, undeniably dangerous glint shining brightly in my eyes. "You did not fire me yesterday, Julian. You liberated me, and you paid me a massive fortune to do it." The moment the stark reality of the final transfer certificate fully registered in his frantic mind, Julian completely snapped. The remaining, fragile shreds of his carefully curated corporate persona evaporated entirely. He lunged forward, his face violently twisted in raw, unfiltered rage, screaming at the top of his lungs, completely losing all remnants of his dignity. "I will sue you into the absolute ground. I will drag you through every single federal court in this country. You stole from Vanguard. This is nothing but blatant corporate espionage," he bellowed, his voice echoing harshly off the high ceilings of my living room. Before I even needed to respond, my private corporate attorney, who had been standing quietly in the shadowy foyer just out of sight, stepped gracefully into the bright living room. He did not raise his voice. He simply held up a crisp, high-resolution copy of the official termination mandate that Julian had signed just 24 hours earlier. "On the contrary, Julian," my lawyer stated, his tone as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, "you proudly signed an unconditional, immediate termination with cause, deliberately and aggressively bypassing a standard legal review by your own internal department, by your own highly documented, impulsive actions. You legally severed my client from any and all corporate non-compete clauses and fiduciary restrictions previously tied to Vanguard Pinnacle Properties. You practically gift-wrapped her the absolute legal right to walk away with her private clients. If you attempt to file a single lawsuit, we will publicly present this document to the media, and a federal judge will laugh you straight out of the courtroom." Julian collapsed heavily onto the floor, his knees giving out as the fight completely drained from his trembling body. He finally understood that he was beaten flawlessly. By sunset that exact evening, the Vanguard Board of Directors executed a merciless, brutal purge. They officially terminated Julian's contract effective immediately, completely stripping him of any golden parachute, stock options, or standard severance package in a desperate, ultimately futile attempt to violently cut their losses and appease the furious public shareholders. The professional fallout for him was instantaneous and absolute. Within 48 hours, his name was permanently etched into the unspoken blacklist of the entire Miami financial sector. Absolutely no reputable firm on the Eastern Seaboard would ever look at his resume again. Furthermore, because he had foolishly and blindly leveraged his entire personal portfolio against the now-defunct trust margins, the major banks aggressively called in his massive, looming debts. He lost his luxury downtown penthouse, his fleet of imported sports cars, and every single dime he thought he possessed. He was left entirely with nothing. Exactly 2 weeks later, the atmosphere in my world could not have been more incredibly different. I stood perfectly poised at the grand entrance of my brand-new, ultra-modern penthouse suite overlooking the pristine blue waters of the ocean. With a swift, immensely satisfying snip of heavy golden scissors, I officially cut the velvet ribbon inaugurating Hayes' sovereign wealth. I turned around and warmly welcomed Mr. Silas and the rest of the fiercely loyal billionaire syndicate into a breathtaking, sun-drenched boardroom featuring magnificent floor-to-ceiling windows. There were absolutely no hidden tracking softwares, no petty office politics to navigate, and no arrogant executives constantly breathing down my neck. As the senior partners happily settled into their leather seats, opening celebratory bottles of vintage champagne to toast our new beginning, I walked slowly over to the sweeping glass pane. I stood there in quiet contemplation, looking out over the beautiful sunlit Miami coastline, tracing the exact spots where Vanguard's half-finished, rusting metal skeletons stood completely paralyzed in the far distance. A deep, profoundly powerful sense of absolute satisfaction washed over my entire being. I had flawlessly cleared the ultimate obstacle from my path, not by fighting blindly or raising my voice, but simply by weaponizing the short-sighted, monumental arrogance of my very own enemy against himself. I smiled softly, fully embracing the peaceful silence of total victory. The corporate world is constantly filled with loud, boastful men desperately obsessed with grand illusions of control. But the cold, undeniable truth will always remain exactly the same. True power never actually lies in a flashy, unearned executive title printed proudly on a glass door. True power belongs strictly and permanently to the person who actually holds the keys to the heavy steel vault. Thank you so incredibly much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Where in the world are you currently listening to our story from today? Please let us know in the comments below. If you found today's revenge story completely satisfying and entertaining, we kindly ask for your precious help. Please consider supporting our independent channel with just $1. You can easily and quickly do this by scanning the donation QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the direct link in the description box or the pinned comment section. Your generous, continued support is exactly what allows us to pay our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families and keep creating these high-quality, thrilling stories for you every single week. Thank you once again, and we will absolutely see you in the next episode.